Question mark.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Sorry for the delay this morning. My name is Jim Schoff. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in our Asia program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second session in a two-part series, Next Steps for Alliance Trade and Technology Policy Coordination. Our first session last week provided an evidence-based assessment of the Trump era's trade approach from a U.S. Japan alliance context. The video for that is available on our website. And there's no doubt that we've experienced a dramatic swing these past 4 years with America First following the signing of the TPP at the end of the Obama administration. So there was a dramatic swing at that time. And now we have a more ambiguous slogan of foreign policy for the middle class. Many in the current administration have advocated for trade policy that benefits labor over capital interests, promotes environmental goals, aids in the competition with China, but is also well coordinated with allies. Now, what approach could possibly satisfy labor, Main Street, Wall Street, and allies is one of the questions we're going to talk about today. Where are we heading? And is that the same direction as where we should be heading? And we brought together a great group of people to help us sort this out. We have with us Susan Schwab, who is a strategic advisor in Mayor Brown's international trade practice and former U.S. trade representative. During that time, she helped conclude a free trade agreement with South Korea, among others, and launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP talks back at that time. She's also served in the State Department, was Director General of the Foreign and Commercial Service in the Commerce Department, and has had a stint at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. So she's viewed this all from many vantage points. We are supposed to be joined today by Heizo Takenaka, and we're having some technical difficulties getting him connected, but we're working on that right now. He's in Tokyo. He is Professor Emeritus of Keio University and currently a member of the Policy Council under the Suga administration in Japan. He served as Minister of State for Economic and Fiscal Policy in the Koizumi Cabinet in 2001, and later as Minister of Privatization of Postal Services and then Minister for Internal Affairs and Communications. We also have with us Fran Stewart, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Ohio Manufacturing Institute, and she writes about public policy and economic development with a special interest in workforce issues and regional resilience, the author of The STEM Dilemma, Skills That Matter to Regions, and has contributed to regional studies led by universities and think tanks, including the Carnegie Endowment's Foreign Policy for the Middle Class case study in Ohio from 2018. So pleased to have her with us. And of course, we also have Marc Mealy, who is the Senior Vice President for Policy at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, where he coordinates advocacy efforts across their country and industry committees. He's the in-house lead on international trade policy. Marc began his career as an economist with the International Trade Policy Division of USDA's Foreign Agricultural Services and worked on Capitol Hill as well. So welcome, Marc, and thank you for joining us today. So we're going to work around the absence of Tanaka-san, and hopefully he'll be able to join us here relatively soon. But Susan, I wanted to ask you the first question anyway. You've looked at new administrations coming and going from various vantage points in Washington, from both parties, as they try to reorient their trade and commercial policy. And so I wanted to ask you, what strikes you this time around as you watch the Biden team begin taking over for the Trump team? What important signals or signs are you looking for that will help you refine your analysis about what's ahead?
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for the invitation. And it's a great question. You started articulating some of it. I think, at first blush, the most interesting thing is recognizing that the Trump administration, I think we would all agree, made a major change in U.S. trade policy when they came in, change relative to really virtually every other administration that came before it. Compared to that, so far, the Biden administration looks as though their trade policy will be quite similar to the Trump administration's trade policy. The tone will be different. It'll be less noisy. There'll be fewer tweets. But so far in substance, we haven't seen signals of a whole lot of difference. Now, some nuances and some potential difference. we clearly see there'll be that they're signaling differences in climate, no question. Emphasis on human rights that we didn't necessarily see before. And there's some inherent discrepancies or potential discrepancies in some of the things you described, some of the things we've seen. For example, trade is not supposed to be a priority initially. It's a domestic focus, domestic economic focus. But China's a priority. And therefore, obviously, trade with China is a priority. And therefore, working with allies vis-a-vis China is a priority. So that is one of the potential discrepancies. Being nicer to allies is something that they have talked about, except that the Biden administration has constituencies that, really like those steel and aluminum tariffs, including the ones that are still up vis-a-vis imports from allies. So what will happen with those? Similarly, if you go after allies with human rights issues, some of those allies will think that's kind of unkind. And you got to square that, you got to square that circle in terms of standing on principle and still caring about your relationship with Mexico, with Guatemala, with, the countries where there are human rights issues. Or worker rights issues, and where you need to figure out how you're going to enforce trade agreements and still get along. I think on the pro-trade side, and I think the signal that I will be looking for is what happens between now and end of April, middle of May, in terms of the U.S. and UK potential trade agreement. Because Trade Promotion Authority runs out July 1 of this year. And there are some connected with the new administration who think you don't need Trade Promotion Authority to get a trade agreement through. I've seen that movie before, and it doesn't work. And therefore, it seems to me that if the Biden administration wants to show that they are capable of negotiating trade agreements with trading partners, with allies, that they aren't going to be sitting on the sidelines for the next 4 years while everybody else is negotiating trade agreements with everybody else. Sending that signal by doing a deal with the UK that was set up in large measure in the last administration would be a pretty good way of doing it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thanks for that. And of course, I saw in the news today that the UK trade minister expects to start potential TPP talks or entering the CPTPP with Japan before the end of the year. So we'll see how that goes. I'm thrilled to see Takenaka Sensei join us. Thank you. Sorry for any of the technical trouble that you had.
I'm very sorry to be late.
No, that's quite all right. This is good timing. We actually got just to your question here. I've already introduced you and everyone here, and one of the Takenaka Sensei is someone I've always looked up to and respected his views and career. And he wrote an op-ed back in 2018 about Trump's trade policy, actually, that I wanted to revisit. Because you wrote, talked about the multifaceted impact of Trump's trade approach on Japan-U.S. bilateral trade relations, the broader U.S.-China hegemonic competition now entangled in trade and technology, the impact on currency rates, and the negative impact of Trump's undermining of the WTO. So you even wondered in the piece whether this was a one-off phenomena or just like a passing reign. I wanted to ask you, what do you think now, looking back on the whole 4 years of the impact of that experience? Does Japan still need an umbrella or a raincoat, or does the situation seem a little sunnier to you?
Well, thank you very much for raising a very interesting question. Yes, well, maybe you understand that Japan has been receiving a huge benefit from the liberal world order. After the Second World War, especially free trade, multilateralism, and globalization, and so on. And the rule maker of this liberal world order was the United States. Japan was relatively the follower. However, all of a sudden, the rule maker left, and so we are very upset about that. Yes, well, at the same time, Japan is still going to be not a rule maker. We cannot be a rule maker, but we are going to be the rule shaper of the liberal world order, especially free trade. And after the United States left the TPP agreement, Japan worked with other countries, and we concluded TPP 11. And also, the Japan concluded the free trade agreement or economic partnership agreement with EU. And now we are moving to RCEP, regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement, etc., etc. We are going to be a rule shaper. In that sense, we are still worrying about the change of the American attitude under Trump administration. But still, I understand that the United States also changing their attitude. So I do not say we're in the heavy rain. At the same time, we do not think we are in a very sunny days, but still cloudy, maybe. So we are watching very carefully what will happen to the United States under new President Biden. But I basically appreciate the effort by President Biden on the climate change issues. Also expect that another change will happen to the trade negotiations. So we are waiting for the United States coming back to TPP. This is the current situation. And also in Japan, new prime minister appeared 6 months ago, and new prime minister Suga is succeeding the various kind of policy from the previous Abe government. So anyway, I really hope new President Biden, new Prime Minister Suga will have a very good talk next month, maybe quite soon. So we are waiting for a very good result.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's very interesting, because I do hear from a lot of my Japanese friends, even though they understand the political and trade environment in the United States not being so interested in multilateral trade agreements like the TPP right now, there's still a real hope, and I think kind of a expectation that maybe the Biden administration will move in that direction. But let me turn to Fran Stewart, because she can give us a little bit of the view of the research and work that has shaped some of the thinking of people who have entered into the Biden administration. Fran, you've spent a lot of time evaluating the impact of trade and economic development policies on manufacturing and local economic conditions in states like Ohio, and you contributed to the Ohio case study of foreign policy for the middle class. What did you learn from that case study experience and from your related work? And do you think these lessons are reflected in some recent trade measures that we've seen, such as the adjustments that the Democrats in the House of Representatives pushed for in USMCA at the end of 2019, or Biden's Made in America executive order from January?
Well, thank you for having me, Jim. I really appreciate being part of the conversation. And I first want to say that I was very gratified to be part of the foreign policy for the middle class study. And I commend Carnegie for taking it on. I think it was a very timely and worthwhile topic. And I'm very hopeful that that those at Carnegie who oversaw the project will continue to draw on what they learned as they perform their new roles in the Biden administration. So one of the key takeaways of the project was that labeling Trump voters of Ohio, and I suspect elsewhere, as anti-trade was a huge mischaracterization or misunderstanding. Ohio soybean farmers who export to China, or the pork product processor who sells into Mexico, or beef exporters to Japan very much believe in trade and the markets and opportunities that trade agreements mean for them. The tariffs and retaliations during the Trump administration directly affected their livelihoods, but at the same time, even those who may have questioned some of the specific tactics of the Trump administration supported the need to stand up to what they considered unfair practices coming primarily out of China. So the Ohioans we spoke to would say that they simply wanted a fair shake for themselves and their communities. And in no way were people advocating to back away from trade. Export jobs are, we have about 250,000 jobs directly related to export activities in Ohio. And so what we heard from Ohioans was a need to flip the script about trade. In the past, the assumption was that those who were in the position to pursue agreements would have the view that what's good for the country is going to ultimately be good for American communities. And a welcome reframing would be to think about how trade helps strengthen U.S. communities, which then ultimately will be good for the country. So to that effect, elements of the USMCA that encourage increased international investment and protect workers and look out for communities, is very much welcome. Foreign direct investment, especially from Japanese-based companies, has become very important to Ohio's economy and the economy of many other states in the United States. So the Biden administration's announced plan to buy American using the procurement power of the federal government will also come as welcome news to Ohioans, recognizing that taxpayer money should be used to cycle through and support communities instead of undermining them. And I think in particular, the administration's focus on supply chains is really relevant, particularly in light of what we've seen with COVID, and that it shows the risks of having huge pieces of the supply chain missing. And companies, manufacturers that I've talked to have had issues where they would have to shut down production because they couldn't get parts from other parts of the world. And so that is something to really think about going forward. But as trade agreements are being reshaped, it's also really important for policymakers to keep in mind that change means uncertainty, and uncertainty is really difficult for businesses to deal with. And so whatever reshaping happens in the trade policy world, it's important to remember that there's got to be clarity for the businesses that are going to have to operate in this new environment.
Right, thank you. Well, that's a good segue to talk to a representative of some businesses. I guess I did want to mention briefly, though, because you mentioned the Buy America piece and the Japanese investment in Ohio. Unlike the Trump administration that was talking about differentiating between companies on the Section 232, the national security exemption, by nationality of the company, the whole Buy America piece now I expect will include just companies that are in America. So that will cover Japanese and other foreign.
Right, you have to think about
well.
many of the Japanese vehicles rate very highly as being the most American cars that are made these days. And so how do you define what is American made sometimes?
Yeah. So Marc, I imagine that your members probably had a mixed experience with Trump's trade approach and aggressive actions against China, maybe some benefiting from supply chain shifts that created new opportunities and others possibly suffered from the disruption. What were the most impactful aspects, pro or con, about Trump's trade actions on your members, and what priorities do they have for the new Biden administration?
Thanks, Jim. And again, it's great to be part of this discussion. I think you captured it well when you said, obviously, and Sue, you did as well, the Trump administration's trade policy really represented a fundamental shift in what everyone was sort of accustomed to for the last several decades. So for many of America's, let's say, global multinational corporations, it definitely became an additional catalyst for looking at, as you said, readjusting or evolving their regional supply chains, whether it be globally or particularly in Asia. And obviously, we focus on the countries in Southeast Asia, places like Malaysia and Vietnam and those economies. And when the whole sort of U.S.-China tariff conflict really ramped up, it really became an additional catalyst for American companies, but also other global firms to really look at Southeast Asia as an alternative, commercially competitive location for supply chains and sourcing nodes. I think for the other key issue, though, that I've been very much thinking about, and I think our members are thinking about with the new administration, is, and again, Sue, I think you raised a good point earlier, as we're kind of now the new administration trying to figure out what does a foreign policy or a trade policy, for the middle class, for manufacturing, what does it really mean in terms of policy? The rest of the world, and particularly in the Asia Pacific region, oftentimes with the support of and leadership of the government of Japan, are moving forward with new preferential trade frameworks. And I know we haven't really discussed, or we may have a chance to talk about the RCEP agreement, which is sort of the latest Pan-Asian framework that was successfully signed last year. And, when I heard the signing, I was like, okay, it'll take about maybe a year and a half for this thing to actually get done and be ratified. At the pace that the countries that are members of RCEP are moving right now, I think it's a good shot. RCEP could go live before the end of 2021. And while RCEP is not a quote unquote gold standard agreement, the one thing that I think everyone kind of recognizes, and Fran, it kind of goes to the point you just offered about how businesses value and appreciate certainty and predictability. The one thing I can't think anyone disagrees with is that RCEP will increase predictability and certainty for trade within Asia. Therefore, Asian companies, Japanese companies, Malaysian companies, RCEP represents a new framework that will increase sort of that intra-Asian regional trade reality. In fact, I've seen some forecasts by the Asian Development Bank that's highlighted the kind of income gains that Asian countries are likely to benefit from the combination of both RCEP and CPTPP. The reason why I think that matters, bringing us back to sort of the US context, is that while for the global American companies who have the wherewithal and the resources to sort of navigate some of these newer frameworks, it's American-based, whether they be foreign-owned or domestically owned, businesses that produce goods and services that may find themselves at a competitive disadvantage in terms of the tariff rates they face. So for example, Fran, you mentioned Ohio. You're absolutely right. Ohio by itself is doing close to $2 billion a year in goods and commodity exports to the 10 countries in Southeast Asia. I'm to tell you, that's real income. That's supporting real jobs in Ohio. The challenge I see in the months and maybe before TPA gets reconfirmed is that, there are, as we all know, there are good companies in Canada. There are good companies in Mexico that make quality products. There are good companies in Japan that make quality products. Those businesses are now going to have basically a tariff advantage over companies in Ohio, in markets like Vietnam, fast-growing markets, big populations, in countries like Indonesia, almost 300 million people. And what I'll be interested to see in about a year from now, if we start seeing some of our exports from Ohio start to maybe trend in a different direction, I think it would be safe to say that some of these new preferential trade agreements may not be the total cause of that trend, but I would definitely say would be one of the factors that we may have to sort of come to terms with. What does it really mean that these countries are moving forward with new agreements? And right now, America, as we're focused on domestic economic stuff, we're not really able to participate in some of these new frameworks.
Can I?
Yeah. Go ahead, Susan.
Can I jump in and reinforce something that Marc just said? Because he is absolutely right. And a lot of times, American politicians don't realize that the biggest hit is small and medium-sized companies that can't transcend those tariff barriers. When there's a block, whether it's EU or RCEP or and others have free trade within that block, small and medium-sized companies are kept out. Major manufacturers, they're just going to have to invest within that block, right? So U.S. workers lose and U.S. small and medium-sized companies lose. And some of that you see, and some of that you don't see. It doesn't show up in the statistics.
Mhm.
So you end up with, sort of Asia for Asia production, where you might have had some more US production, Asia export. But the kind of thing with CPTPP without the US, RCEP, it leads to those kinds of trends that Marc's alluding to. And I think it's a serious issue, but not just major manufacturers and US workers losing out, but small, medium-sized companies, because they can't even invest behind those walls.
Yeah. Takenaka Sensei, can I ask you your view about from Japan about RCEP and the momentum with CPTPP, and do you see potentially kind of an intra-Asian strengthening of trade networks or not?
Well, basically, Japan, maybe business leaders and the political leaders are considering two things. One is, of course, the free trade is very important to enhance the total economic activity. At the same time, the confrontation between China and the United States is becoming seriously, much more serious. I'm afraid that even after Trump left. And this is not a trade war. This is the confrontation between the free capitalism and the state capitalism. Under such circumstances, well, block building is going ahead. This is quite, we are very afraid of that. Of course, this will not bring any benefit. However, since this is the confrontation regarding hegemony of the United States and China, for Japan, America is the most important allied country. On the other hand, China is the most important trade partner. So this is a very difficult, serious problem for us. Regarding RCEP, this is very important because in this RCEP, China is included, Korea is included, Japan is included. This is a very fast time that these three countries, major three countries, join this kind of agreement. One regret is India is not included. However, this is forming a very important free trade area. Honestly, the degree of freedom, degree of liberalization is not very high because China's attitude is still very solid. However, still we recognize this is important progress. So China is here, and at the same time, Japan and the United States agreed 2 years ago, at the end of 2019, a kind of U.S. Japan trade agreement and the U.S. Japan digital trade agreement. This kind of effort is very important. So really, Japan want to be a catalyst, something like a catalyst to connect the Asian countries and also the most important country, the United States. So in that sense, as I mentioned, TPP is also CPTPP is an important vehicle to connect these. This is the reason why we are expecting that the United States is coming back to TPP. This is the basic position. Well, the United States is a very important country. At the same time, China is an important trade partner. We are in between the United States and China. Many, not only Japan, many Asian countries maybe have this kind of feeling, I imagine.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you touched on a couple of the themes that I really want to talk about today before we open it up to our audience for questions. I just want to let the audience know that you can send in a question through the chat function or the comment function on the YouTube channel, and we'll get to that toward the end. But the two broad themes I wanted to talk about, one is this idea of whether or not you think we've reached an important turning point with regard to trade policy, not just in the U.S. more broadly, where not just in the U.S. but more broadly, where the disillusionment with globalization and concern about technological change and economic inequality is mixing with this great power rivalry that Takenaka Sensei referenced to force us into a new era of choosing sides, of different sets of rules, maybe declining efficiencies and potential economic instability as a result. I certainly, some of the people coming into the Biden administration now are really focused on this idea of addressing economic inequality and trade enforcement because of part of what Fran talked about as well. That people feel that the rules are stacked against them, where other countries are not obeying the rules that we spent so much time to set up. So I wonder, am I overinterpreting events of the last few years and kind of the issue of the moment, where people are talking about these kinds of liberal trade or economic policies, or do you think we are in some kind of a turning point of sorts in terms of thinking about trade policy? And I offer this up to anyone who would like to take that on.
Maybe just to start us off, Jim, I think, again, looking at the Asia Pacific region, I think it's safe to say that if we are entering a new era, it's an era of competing choices and competing frameworks, and let's say no longer sort of a one sort of single dominant framework. More and more countries, as they enter into sort of some of these different types of preferential agreements, some quote unquote higher standard than others, at the end of the day, they do have the ability to shape commercial realities. And businesses, whether they be local businesses or international businesses that are considering looking at international commercial opportunities, need to understand that there are, as I said, sort of these competing frameworks. One of the things I used to always make the point was many, many years ago when TPP was getting started, and then RCEP negotiations, and, we were all said, oh yeah, RCEP is China's attempt to craft something that becomes the alternative to America's TPP. And I would always make the argument, I thought that was a little bit zero sum or black and white. And the more nuanced reality was that ultimately RCEP and CPTPP or TPP 11 would both become realities in the Asia Pacific region. And therefore, again, for the global companies that have these resources, the ability to navigate these things, it just becomes another set of variables they take into account when they're looking at, making investment decisions and what have you. I think that's where we're headed to, again, if RCEP goes into force by the end of this year, early into next year. Different companies, different industries, different sectors, they'll assess which framework offers, let's say, the most commercial benefits or opportunities if they're trying to ship a product from country X to country Y. They may take advantage of the RCEP framework. Or for a different industry and different company, they may look at the TPP 11 framework if that offers sort of the best tariff-free or duty-free commercial opportunity. So I think there's that choices that are out there. And we haven't even really mentioned the next generation sort of digital agreements that are also now emerging, led by U.S. and Japan or Singapore. These are now also going to become realities that will influence the rules of the road for trade. And again, for the global firms, they'll figure out, again, which one of these frameworks offers the best opportunity for a certain type of commercial activity. And I think, Sue, and you mentioned earlier, it's really for the American context, it's really, again, I think the impacts on the smaller and medium-sized firms that are based here in America, that are going to find that as these new frameworks go into force, if America is not participating in them, it can really create a disadvantage, a commercial disadvantage.
But there is this kind of strategic overlay now, right? This U.S.-China competition. There seems to be an extra layer now put on this global trade policy formula in terms of technology rules, supply chains, critical technologies, emerging technologies. I wonder if that
national security.
If that becomes a kind of a complicating factor to the economic realities or the trade realities that you're describing.
So I don't think that it's been necessarily the the discussion about trade now that we're having is not necessarily a turning point in the minds of many Ohioans. It's who've seen their jobs leave for lower cost areas and go out of business. And to Marc's point, it may miss some of what they're thinking, may miss the forward opportunities, and it may be very backward looking. But it's hard when you feel like you've been sold that trade lifts all boats, and you've seen that your boat is washed up on the rocks. That's a hard image to put aside and to suddenly go forward. But at the same time, I speak to Ohio manufacturers all the time, and the ones who are exporting, they're amazing at how they and how they're conducting their businesses and the opportunities that they have been able to tap into. But so maybe the turning point is that the views that trade policies have not necessarily benefited everyone equally is finally being understood and internalized. And to Susan's point, some with the focus of the Biden administration on domestic policy, some of the response to the trade disruptions that communities have seen has to come through domestic policy. I mean, we have to be educating people for new jobs, and we have to be thinking about what happens to communities when their major plant shuts down, virtually overnight. And but at the same time, it's also important to understand that trade, particularly with China, is where a lot of the anger and the frustration is, because yes, the whole playing field that didn't seem very level to a lot of manufacturers throughout Ohio and the country. So that's where a lot of the anger may be. But technological change and automation has accounted for most of the manufacturing job losses in Ohio, and even more automation is looming. And so that's a separate issue, but it's interrelated in many respects.
I think both Fran and Marc really nail the key issues coming into play. And so it is a multiple factor set of considerations where national security and domestic economic and political considerations are taking a higher priority perhaps in trade policy making than in the past, but they've always been a factor in terms of trade policy making. Trade policy making has always been foreign policy, domestic politics, international economic policy, domestic economics. However, the China shocks, the 1990s, early 2000s, the dislocation, particularly in the middle of the country, that had a profound impact in terms of trade politics in this country. And now the national security issues associated with U.S. China is having a pronounced impact in terms of the relationship. And then you've got, overlay that with COVID, where you have that much more attention being paid to sustainable, reliable supply chains. And so I think a lot what you're seeing is sort of that combination. And the question is, are we able to navigate more nuanced trade policies that don't over-rotate? Because if you over-rotate, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. You're just going to make yourself, you build walls, you're going to be uncompetitive. As Fran described, because so much of the job loss really is attributable to non-trade things. So if you look for trade solutions to non-trade problems, you're going to be in trouble. Yeah. But there are sectors where you are going to be looking for more secure supply chains, but they don't have to be all U.S. They can be trusted partners involved in those supply chains. How do you navigate those kinds of issues going forward? And there's a lot of thought being put into that.
Yeah. Takenaka Sensei, please.
Well, thank you very much. Your opinions are very persuasive, I understand. It is true, we are surely moving to the new era. but in new era, in this new era, we have to consider some fundamental change. That is, as you mentioned already, the digitalization. Yes, so we will compete and we'll cooperate. And so digitalized capitalism. And in this world, in the most liberalized country, the United States, is going to be a winner, like GAFA is there, where new innovation are born in the United States, in the liberalized world. On the other hand, another champion is the state-owned, state capitalism country, where because the very strong leadership of the Communist Party, they created, where Alibaba, Tencent, etc., etc. So European countries and Japan and other countries are in between, not so liberalized, not strongly controlled by the government, etc., etc. So, well, under such circumstances, well, we have to cooperate with each other, even in the field of trade and establishing, supply chain. But in this case, and additionally, in this new era, we have to consider the impact of the COVID-19. Well, amazingly, the United States is expanding the budget deficit. And also Japan, other countries have been increasing their budget deficit. Well, we are now in the midst of the fight against the COVID-19. So this kind of expansionism is okay. However, gradually we have to normalize this kind of policy. Under such circumstances, economic management will become very difficult. So another kind of policy coordination will become necessary. So this will again give some impact. This is not negative, positive impact for even in the field of trade, because we have to cooperate each other. Policy coordination is needed. So under such circumstances, on one hand, digitalization will provide some severe competition, some difficulties. At the same time, we need another effort of policy coordination. So we are now in between these difficulties and also another positive factor in this new era. So it is very important in that sense. Against I expect the leadership of the United States in the world system.
Thank you. Well, and as you alluded to before, too, the role of Japan kind of as a catalyst or as a bridge, or the U.S. and Japan as partners. Certainly, the Biden team is very focused on alliances and the idea that trying to do this together with as many countries as possible is extremely important. We have a couple of questions coming in from the chat. Josh Levy asks us to kind of clarify this idea of unfair behavior by China. What is unfair, and how should the U.S. make policy to remedy that? Is it wages, subsidies, other kinds of issues? Is there actually something we can do about that, or is it we just have to combat it with our own production policies?
I'm happy to start taking a swing at that. It's a really, really good question, because we all throw around the phrase unfair trade practices. And in fact, there is a formal set of unfair trade practices agreed under domestic law, both U.S. law and international trade agreements. The WTO has definitions for unfair trade practices. U.S. trade law has definitions, and examples there are dumped and subsidized products. So dumped product meaning if I'm producing a good, if I'm a company, I'm producing a good, and I'm selling that product in your market for less than I sell it in my own market, then that's an unfair trade practice. Or if I'm a government and I am subsidizing the export of that product, that is an unfair trade practice. But I think fundamentally, the kind of unfair trade practice that we talk about nowadays, and we probably shouldn't label it that, the kind of practice that is of concern vis-a-vis China has to do with very aggressive industrial policies that are trade distorting. And by this I mean for example, steel, solar panels, well, you can go through a whole lot of sectors where because China's a non-market economy, there's a huge amount of subsidization, and that subsidization results in incredible overcapacity. So in steel, for example, China producing steel that is 2/3 more than they could ever use, and significantly more than the whole rest of the world combined. So what do they do with that steel? That steel gets dumped on the rest of the world, and that depresses prices. And that means that every other country's steel production, which might have been perfectly efficient and perfectly competitive using market conditions, can't compete. And therefore, China exporting what I would argue are its economic mistakes is putting everybody else out of business. That is one of the kind of trade distorting practices. And then at the high end, the technology end, you have issues associated with technology theft, forced technology transfer. It's companies in the private sector having to compete with governments and state-owned enterprises. So that's the other area, sort of at the higher end of the technology spectrum. I'll stop there, but that's the kind of general area where there may not be more specific rules to address, unlike formal anti-dumping or countervailing duty laws.
Yeah.
Right, and one of the, just real quick, one of the anecdotes that we have in the report is that the remedies for like products that were essentially being copied and then had state support and were being undersold to in the U.S. market, when a company that we spoke to would then take their complaint to the World Trade Organization, which is supposed to help remedy the situation, it took so long for them to get the final verdict that yes, their part was being experiencing predatory trade practices. They were already out of business. You know, their division was already lost. They couldn't sustain that long of the process to wind its way through the World Trade Organization. And so that and I mean, in some ways, people would also say low price, you know, the low cost, you know, they point a finger at low cost workers, which is not necessarily unfair, but it is really disruptive. I mean, if it happens so quickly that products move around and then your company can't compete because your labor costs are higher.
Yeah.
I'd like to raise 2 points, some institutional one. One is the role of the central bank. Well, central bank plays a very important role to decide the monetary policy. It's important to decide the exchange rate. So in most countries like the United States and Japan, central bank is independent from the government. However, in China, central bank is a part of the government. So this is indicating exchange rate is politically decided. Yeah, I'm a little bit exaggeration, but this is a very important part. Another one is in the so-called digitalized world, the data transaction is very important. So free data trade is important, but we need trust. However, very regulatory in some cases in China, data privacy is ignored. But now that collecting big data is very important to strengthen the competitiveness. So the data-related issue or data privacy, this is another very different case in the case of China. Well, these are the very important point in case we discuss the differences between American capitalism and the Chinese state capitalism.
Yeah. So go ahead, Marc.
One particular point, I think we've touched on a little bit some of the questions also about like that I really get at the point of a lot of the kinds of the issues that we're talking about, while there may be these international rules and clear definitions, the reality also is there can be varying perspectives on the very same question. So at one point, what distinguishes a state champion like Alibaba from, another state-owned company in a different European country? In other words, if we throw the term, they're a state-owned company, right? But are there differences? How they act in the marketplace, are there differences? Sue, you know this, for example, even when we talk about exchange rates and currencies, the fact that as countries who are negotiating and coming together to put together a framework, we're unable to find a consensus on the very quote unquote definition of currency manipulation, tells us there still are these different perceptions. I've had some central bankers, friends of mine in Asia, who, Takenaka, you mentioned, they may say, yeah, we think China does funny things with its currency for trade benefits, but we also feel a certain kind of way when America's Federal Reserve throws in a few $1 trillion of liquidity, and then that avalanche of capital flows right out to Asia and then forces me as a central bank, where we think all of our fundamentals are proper, but now our exchange rates are now caught up in disarray. That's a reality that does exist right now, where we haven't been able to sort of fashion those kinds of consensuses on even some of the very same terms we oftentimes hear thrown around.
Yeah. So we're getting toward the end, but I want to come back to the U.S. Japan piece very briefly, and we'll go around and get some people's reactions. But Takenaka Sensei, maybe I'll start with you on this question, because what you described, one way of dealing with these challenges that we're facing, trade practices from China, is to kind of team up, right? U.S., Japan, others, let's team up and share data. Let's team up and reform the WTO so it works better. Let's team up and organize supply chains in ways that are more independent of China. But from Japan's perspective, is that an attractive strategy? But how does that jeopardize your relationship with China and the value, the access to that market?
Well, of course, this is a very difficult issue for Japan. But as I mentioned already, Japan is not only for Japan, but for most Asian countries. China is the most important trade partner. Under such circumstances, well, yes, it is very important for us to involve the China in our liberal world order. But still, we are expecting that. Sometimes some strong action is needed on China. Actually, Mr. Trump took that kind of attitude, and maybe new President Biden will take the similar action on one hand. At the same time, it is very important also to invite them to the free trade agreement like RCEP. So in that sense, there is no absolute answer, the correct answer on that. But we expect the United States coming up to TPP. If so, in TPP, we can invite other countries, and including China. By doing that, we can find out a very creative, constructive solution in this field. I'm sorry, this is not a very concrete answer, but it's a basic attitude, yes.
Well, I think that's the reality, though. One thing I certainly have taken away from today's discussion is the complexity of the situation. That multiple stakeholders have different incentives and issues at play. Does anyone else want to jump in with a final thought? Or
a final thought, I think, there are really good opportunities, particularly, for example, in certain specific industries for U.S. Japan cooperation. Broadly speaking, I think if the Biden administration and the current government in Japan can zero in on some industry, I think, focused areas, and we've mentioned sort of the digital economy stuff, for example, as one area. I think there's lots of opportunity. I think one thing to be really important, though, would be to recognize, and this may be for both governments, so to speak, and maybe even both business communities, to recognize that while there may be synergies of interests that are shared on some issues, they may not exist on all issues. And so therefore, I would hope that because there isn't synergy on all issues, it hinders the ability to work together on the things where the interests do align. I think that would be, for me, the most important thing going forward.
No, that's a good point. It doesn't have to be all or nothing and so absolutist in that. Any other thoughts, Fran or Susan?
Well, I would think that one thing to keep in mind is that there may be all sorts of opportunities for multilateral agreements, probably around pharmaceuticals and medical supplies and essential products and all of that. But what we see is, in a crisis is that nationalism tends to rear its head, and there's, like, you want to hoard your vaccines and hoard your protective equipment and hoard your even toilet paper. And so agreements can, I guess, only go so far from when human nature kicks in.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think it's so important to keep talking about these things and to do so in an alliance context and in a bilateral context and multilateral. So we'll keep doing that and as we go forward. But I really want to thank you all for joining us today and helping us sort through this. I feel a little smarter as a result of listening to you. Thanks to our audience for participating. I know you've managed to address some of the questions that we got in the course of your answers in our discussion, although we did not get to all of them. And I hope we get a chance to see you again soon, hopefully soon in person. And with that, I will simply thank you and wish you a good evening or a good day wherever you may be. So thank you all for joining us and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.